Poetry Lockdown. We are at day 104. So over the last week, and actually longer than a week, really, in the last couple of weeks, I've been really interested in poetic traditions, especially conversation between poets of different eras. So yesterday, I did a lockdown talking about Tiana Clark's work interacting with Phyllis Wheatley's. Earlier, we had Araceli's Germai really talking through the years to Gwendoline Brooks. Today, I want to reference another poet I've done in the series, Robert Hayden. You might remember this would have been like 60 days ago. I did a Robert Hayden's Frederick Douglass, which is an incredible poem. If you haven't heard that one, check it out. Today, I want to talk about his poem, the Ballad of Nat Turner, which a contemporary poet, terrific contemporary poet, Rowan Ricardo Phillips, has written extensively on in his book, When Blackness Rhymes with Blackness. And that phrase actually comes from his analysis, poetically done, of the Ballad of Nat Turner. I just think it's really, really important when you're, a poet and you're creating work, that work is in conversation. It's entering this vast river of poetry. At least that's a metaphor I like to think about. Before I do that, I actually want to give a little context kind of on Rowan Ricardo Phillips's work, and also just direct you to an incredible interview. So Bomb Magazine, they published this, I think, mid-June, June 11th, an interview between Rowan Ricardo Phillips and Gregory Pardlow, another excellent poet. And basically, they're kind of sending letters to each other back and forth during the quarantine, asking like, what would an epic poem, specifically from the African American experience, look like? And I believe this was before George Floyd was murdered and all that's happened since then. But during the quarantine, and Phillips says something that I think would be a really nice way to introduce the Ballad of Nat Turner. So I want to quote from his letter to Gregory Pardlow. He says about the epic poetry, the epic brings the black poet faithfully, reliably to slavery. It's understandable, as the slave trade was our expulsion from Eden and into modernity, not as actors in an emergent capitalism, but rather as capital. Jamaica Kincaid put it so well, it's worth, like most of her writing, putting to memory. Quote, and he's quoting from Kincaid. Do you know why people like me are shy about being capitalists? Well, it's because we, for as long as we have known you, were capital, like bales of cotton and sacks of sugar, and you were the commanding, cruel capitalists. And the memory of this is so strong, the experience so recent, that we can't quite bring ourselves to embrace this idea that you think so much of. As for what we were like before we met you, I no longer care. No periods of time over which my ancestors held sway, no documentation of complex civilizations is any comfort to me. And that's the end of the Kincaid quote. Right? And then Phillips says, and that unelaborated you dangling like a dagger, right? Which to me seems like an apt way to introduce the Ballad of Nat Turner, right? In 1831, he led a slave rebellion, right? And whites were killed, right? And he led the killing of those whites. And all of a sudden, right, white people are like, oh my goodness, right? Black people, they're not appreciating this institution. And so, there was, obviously abolitionists saw this as a way to say, okay, so there's some momentum for abolishing slavery, but slaveholders, it was a crackdown, right? And literacy, right, was something that was whites held that over blacks and made it so that, I think the literacy rate was 10% among African Americans at that time, right? So this was an epical moment in American history. And Robert Hayden writes the poem in Nat Turner's voice. So I'll read that now. All right. The Ballad of Nat Turner. Then fled, O brethren, the wicked Juba, and wandered far from curfew joys in the dismal's night. Full of St. Elmo's fire, in scary night I wandered, praying, Lord God, my harshener, speak to me now or let me die. Speak, Lord, to this mourner. and came at length to livid trees where Igbo warriors hung shadowless, turning in wind that moaned like Africa, their bell-tongue bodies dead, their eyes alive with the anger deep in my own heart. Is this the sign forepromised me? The spirits vanished. Afraid and lonely, I wandered on in blackness. Speak to me now, or let me die. Die, whispered the blackness, and wild things gasped and scuffled in the night. Seething shapes of evil frolicked upon the air. I reeled with fear. I prayed. Sudden brightness clove the praying darkness, brightness that was itself a golden darkness, brightness so bright that it was darkness. And there were angels, their faces hidden from me, angels at war with one another, angels in dazzling combat. And oh, the splendor, the fearful splendor of that warring. Hide me, I cried to rock and bramble. Hide me, the rock, the bramble cried. How tell you of that holy battle? The shock of wing on wing and sword on sword was the tumult of a taken city burning. I cannot say how long they strove, for the wheel in a turning wheel which is time and eternity had ceased its whirling, and owl and moccasin, panther and nameless beast, and I were held like creatures fixed in flaming, in fiery amber. But I saw, oh, many of those mighty beings waver and fall, streaking down into swamp water, and the water hissed and steamed and bubbled and locked, shuddering over the fallen, and soon was motionless. Then that massive light began unfolding slowly in upon itself, and I beheld the conqueror faces, and lo, they were like mine. I saw they were like mine, and in joy and terror wept, praising Jehovah. O praised my harshener, till a sleep came over me, a sleep heavy as death. And when I awoke at last free and purified, I rose and prayed and returned after a time to the blazing fields, to the humbleness, and bided my time. Wow. So when you read a masterpiece like I just did right there, it's pretty intimidating to try to say anything. That's what I've been doing with these lockdowns. I read a poem and I say why I admire it. One of the things I'm struck by, and a lot of commentators in this poem have said this, is they're struck by the fact that it's the Ballad of Nat Turner, but really it doesn't go into any of the rebellion, the revolt, the battle. It's all about really the vision of Nat Turner that inspired him, and he's speaking that vision. It appears to me, right, when he says, "Oh, brethren," that he's speaking that vision to other slaves who might be participating with them. That's how I read it. Like he's kind of recounting this, and then speaking about how he's going to bide his time. Now, a better critic than me, and a critic who writes in poetry, which is pretty amazing. I just want to show you this. So this is, make sure I get in the screen. This is when blackness rhymes with blackness. You're not gonna be able to see all of it, but what I just want to communicate is that's in verse, right? So Rowan Ricardo Phillips wrote analysis of this poem in terza rima verse, like that's the form Dante used in the Divine Comedy. It's incredibly impressive. It's pretty amazing, and it's incredibly insightful too. He noticed something that I definitely didn't notice, and I've read this 3 or 4 times, and it's really the title of this book and this piece of analysis that's in verse. When blackness rhymes with blackness, like if you look at the poem itself, you scan back up, a lot of the quatrains have sort of an off rhyme or a slant rhyme, but then there are some times where the rhymes are the same word, right? So he notes that blackness and time, they rhyme with each other, right? So the spirits vanished. Afraid and lonely, I wandered on in blackness. Speak to me now or let me die. Die, whispered the blackness. And here's just from Phillips's commentary what he says, right? This is in his terza rima. He said, "Yet as I peruse the sparse agreements in each stanza, far and fire, amber and waver, I keep returning to blackness and blackness, time and time. Blackness with blackness, then time. From disinterested rhyme to obsessed. There's the coda, the aesthetic moral that something must lie between our carelessness and our mania, as Hayden well knew. I'm still trying to parse that. What I think I'm understanding from this interpretation of Phillips is that in some ways Hayden's Ballad of Nat Turner is also something about what it means to create art, and especially for an African American to create art. Something must lie between our carelessness and our mania. And that's what I'm gathering so far. It's a powerful poem. It's a disturbing poem. And I would just I just want to keep living with it. But I would really recommend this verse essay, When Blackness Rhymes with Blackness, and I hear it's coming out in book form, re-released, I think by Phillips's publisher, Farrar, Straus and Giroux. So I totally recommend it. As I close out this poetry lockdown, I'm not going to read the whole poem again, but let me read those last two stanzas, which are so powerful, and which Rowan Ricardo Phillips spends time on. Oh, praised my honer, harshener, till a sleep came over me, a sleep heavy as death. And when I awoke at last free and purified, I rose and prayed and returned after a time to the blazing fields, to the humbleness, and bided my time. Thank you, Robert Hayden, for this beautiful poem, this powerful poem. Thank you, Rowan Ricardo Phillips, for your insightful analysis. I should read some of your poems soon. Thank you all for listening. Have a good Saturday.